overall in esports, and of course for Dota too. It's been absolutely explosive and very exciting. We were talking earlier, Ben. I mean, when Sin was still here, we were talking about just how, of course, the caliber also seems to have developed a lot too. What do you think about that, actually? Overall TI caliber from TI5 compared to the past TIs?
I mean, in TI3, it was what Alliance was the clear favorites, and TI4, I would say like DK and EG were pretty high up, and then we got surprised by the top two. And this year, I mean, there are clear favorites, but the skill level I think has been like squeezed a little bit in terms of the difference between its first place and the 16th place team is getting closer and closer each year.
Right.
It makes it much more difficult to predict, and I think the format also allows for a lot of surprises, even though it is a rather long format with the round robin. Like, teams have so many chances to prove themselves, and like even Newbie. I mean, Newbie is, I think, a great example of like, oh, we had no hopes for them, but they're doing very well. It looks like actually Empire ended up taking the victory, but I think they've drawn with every single team. And
yeah, at this point, and that's not a bad result to have so far.
We were discussing about it before. If Newbie were to draw 7 games.
Yeah, there's still the possibility of them going in top 4 depending on how the other matches. At that point, you really are reliant on the other results. I do believe we have some highlights from the end of the game here for Empire versus Newbie in Game 2. So this is where Empire comes back. I mean, Ben, Newbie looked like they were trying to win.
They had to push high ground, and we've talked about being able to push high ground against Ember Spirit, but Empire has Magnus, and they don't have like the Magnus, like AM Magnus PA like we see with the very heavy high ground defense heroes, but I mean, just pushing versus that RP alone is just insanely difficult, and it looks like teams have been valuing that a lot just because of how weak some teams are at breaching that first racks.
And overall, Magnus is one of those heroes that no matter how far behind you are, if you get a good RP, there's always a chance to come back, and that just gives a lot of confidence, I think, as well as a team. If you're playing, that you know that you always have a chance. So.
Yeah, I think the beginning at the end was just a 2-man RP on Ember +1, which is not that devastating. I would say that's a very acceptable outcome for an ultimate, but it's just that they have so much burst and so much follow-up. People die in that like 1 second skewer back to the base.
So there we have it. Empire winning
1-1
against Newbie. Yeah, 1-1 result. So Newbie, I mean, I would say, especially for them, I feel like they would be pretty content considering that no one was really expecting them to do that well. It sounded like Newbie also wasn't really sure exactly how high they should place their goals coming in. They were just like, all right, we're here. Of course, we're going to do our best, but we're not going to come in saying, like, we're going to be the TI champs. We're just going to try to play out each game and see where we end up.
At the same time, though, you can feel it. Like, they're like thirsting for each 2-0 in each of these games. They're like, oh man, we can actually be in top 4.
Yeah.
It's very realistic.
Yeah,
still also, right?
Yeah, definitely still possible. And interesting that we talk about that. Our next match coming up, it is EG versus eHome, and looking at the standings, eHome also 0-3-0 record. So here, if eHome upsets and takes EG 2-0, that's only going to kind of shift the balance. And Newbie also has less of a chance. eHome suddenly boosts their chance by quite a bit by getting those 3 points. But EG definitely looking pretty strong. And we talked about this. They don't look that strong on day ones oftentimes. Then they pick it up. They're back in the groove. Their drafting was quite spectacular yesterday, in my opinion. What do you think, Ben?
They're not very prone to mistakes or tilting, for that matter. And if they have a bad game, they're just like, okay, well, we'll have a better draft for game 2, and they'll just play very safely. I think they trust PPD very much when it comes to drafting and playstyle, and it shows in the confidence of their play and how Sumail plays very aggressively and what heroes they give to fear. They all trust their game plan, and it generally works out to be a very sound and swift one.
Yeah. Winter, what are your thoughts about EG, their shift from day 1 to day 2, and just what we saw from them yesterday? Even on our side, when we were talking about it, we were all pleasantly surprised with, okay, EG's back. This is what EG does. Even if, for instance, we weren't really expecting the Enchantress pick, after you look at it, you guys were discussing, oh, in hindsight, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. It's very EG.
Yeah, we were discussing about, I think in particular I brought up the fact that the difference between the stronger teams and like the ones slightly below is the ability to fix things and to not rectify whatever you feel is wrong in front of. Yes, they didn't have a good first day. I mean the first series, but right after that they changed their draft slightly, I would say, because they had more data to work with against their opponents. Like, everyone played games and they were able to watch everyone else play and decide that, oh, this is probably better for us and we should probably play like this. And the bans that we saw every game, every opponent, they had different bans. It was very good to know good to note that EG bans differently against different opponents. Like against Hot 6, they took out Earthshaker and Lina, which is something not common at all in the first two bans, and it shows a lot. It talks a lot about how EG is as a team.
A lot of preparation goes into that, and you can just tell. I'm mostly curious for the next matchup, EG eHome. I mean, for eHome, very experienced players in there. EG, very experienced player. I'm curious how that's going to clash if the games are going to go late game, which we don't know yet for sure. But I think that if it does, we're going to have a really good match on our hands.
Yeah, day 1 and 2, we were like, all right, games are going much longer than we thought. And then we come into day 3, we kick it off with C9 versus IG going way shorter than I think anyone expected. And even on our mainstream, a lot of our games have been relatively short compared to those first 2 days. Do you think this is just a product of matchups, or do you think it's also just kind of everyone now feeling things out in terms of draft for the other teams, having more information on each other?
Teams are a lot more confident. I think Cloud9 is probably the most prime example of a team that has, had a shaky first series against LGD, and then after that, it's just dominating. They dominated IG with their shutout, and overall, you can just feel it from when you watch their games. They're like winning all 3 of their lanes. They're moving around. They're communicating. And I think some of the teams that we watch, they just, one pick off here or there, or like their lanes just don't go as well as expected, and then they seem a little bit lost. And Cloud9 seems the complete opposite from that.
All right. Now, before we go into the draft, players are getting ready. We're setting everything up, draft of Game 1. Something we talked about earlier, we had some fun stats about Ember, of course, and how we had like the Chinese teams dominating in the early 2 days with that non-Chinese teams not doing so well. Now that's been shifted off. But whenever we watch, of course, we don't get to discuss everything after the game because we're out of time oftentimes. You guys like to kind of theorize on your own about builds and even skill builds and whatnot. And one thing that came up with Ember was, Ember with treads. And for me, like, I don't know that well, but what's your take, Ben?
Well, the standard build has been phase drums or phase drums Battle Fury or phase Battle Fury because you want plus damage for your phase boots, so you do more with each Sleight of Fist. And you don't need any attack speed at all because Sleight of Fist is on a timed cooldown. And we've been seeing a lot more Trez recently. Sumail, I think, was probably one of he's the player that got Treads. I saw it yesterday. I saw it today too. And maybe it's just to make him a little bit more tanky. I think if you're really far ahead, you can go with bots. I think maybe tends to get this build a lot, but that's my preference.
What about you, Winter? What's your take?
I don't really like treads. I don't really like face puts, but I like bots.
Ben's going to leave you hanging. He's like, yeah, I like bots too. And Ben's like, yeah, whatever. I like bots. That's right. I started that trend. But so Ben, you gave us your reason, but if you were to try to get into the player's shoes.
I think treads is much better if you actually get towards the target near. You get the chains off and you get more attacks on because you get better attack speed. Phase gives you more chasing power and more damage, so your slide does more. Overall, I would actually think that the phase is actually much better at fighting. If you constantly fight and keep chasing your targets, phase gives you more mobility and damage-wise, but treads is more stats-wise. Some players think that the enemy has co-op Zeus, maybe Lina, a lot of bursty type of lineups. You want to have the strength treads, so that could be one of the reasons that the players prefer the treads over the phase.
All right, well, we're about to find out if maybe we get to see another Ember in the next game. Draft is ready, ladies and gentlemen, between Evil Geniuses and eHome. eHome really looking for that 2-0, but at the very least, if they draw, they're tied with Newbie in the groups. Not a bad place to be. And EG kicking things off with a Gyro and Dazzleman. Once again, just going for maybe a little bit more specific fans. Of course, Gyro pretty common, but Dazzle has been on the rise. Not every team prioritizing Dazzle so high yet.
I'm looking forward to seeing what Evil Genius is going to open up with. We've seen some interesting openings today, and I think EG's, this is their first game today, so let's see what they picked up from the previous game, because, I'm going to assume that they studied their opponent properly.
I would feel it's Naga, just because that's what they use versus Hot 6, and I think eHome is another team that they haven't been able to play against. I'm not sure about in the scrim environment, but in an official environment, Naga is like a very safe pick for an unknown team because you can out-late game them and you can out-team fight them with them.
Well, eHome thought the same, so they
eHome saying, we saw what happened, we're going to ban that out.
Doesn't make sure that Shadowfeed makes it through, though, as compared to the previous games we've seen today. Obviously, yesterday was a bit different.
Yeah, I'm wondering if E.M.O will pick this up. Like, that's something we've discussed so many times, and every time we think of it one way, we're like, all right, well, should they prioritize Shadow Fiend? And then they don't pick it, and then we get used to that. We're like, well, no one's really been picking Shadow Fiend on the Radiant side. And so many teams are like, no, actually, we still like it. Like, Navi, of course, still prioritizing that quite heavily.
I mean, it really shows that every team has their own priorities, and there's not really like a particular reason that Shadow Fiend must be picked on Radiant at all times. Like, it depends on what you want and what trade-offs you get. Like for EG, probably they feel that we have the co-op, so we're not really that worried about Shadow Fiend becoming too big on the Radiant side. Since we have lane pressure on our side, we could deal with the Shadow Fiend.
E.M also likes to pick up Lina, by the way, against for CTY. So that would, in this case, probably be up against the Queen of Pain.
Yeah, he's a very lane-dominating type of player. His team likes to give him a matchup where the matchup does well for him, so he can actually snowball from there and do a lot for his team.
No, well, Leon is taking a lot of time, and first picking a Razor. Haven't seen Razor show up so early yet, at least in the matches on Arsenal. Oftentimes, kind of just an afterthought to round out a team, to have someone that can stand in the front lines a little bit more than the other heroes they have.
And he's going to be, if they were to put Razor versus Quap, Razor definitely has a good matchup in that regard as well. But I guess apart from Secret, we haven't seen many mid-Razors in general from the other teams apart. Yeah, only Secret does that on a more consistent basis.
Well, they have also played Queen of Pain on Fear yesterday, actually, for his Hot 6. And other games they had, I think it was Sumail on Wind Ranger. So no, I'm a fan of Wind Ranger. I like seeing her. But I haven't seen her being as successful yet, apart from yesterday when Sumail was playing her. And I'm really just curious about hearing your opinion about that. Maybe.
Wind Ranger it's a strange hero because Shackle is like it's great if you can hit it. It's terrible if you can. It's
unreliable.
It's super.
A lot of
unreliable.
skills are great if you can hit it. It's terrible if you can't. But.
Well,
Ravage is
right. But obviously,
but they usually, I think that game they had a song on a siren to somewhat shut up for the Shackle shot. But I think that hero is actually really really good at scaling through the late game and. People used to go mech and 4-step, and I think that build is heavily outdated. But she's extremely good at just bursting down PKB targets and also taking down Roshan, taking down towers. And it is a very suitable hero for Sumail. It just seems like a lot of teams have trouble like finding farm with her, just because she is not your ideal 6-slot hero because she gets hard countered by MKB. But at the same time, she can fight very very often. But you just have to make sure you don't lose out on farm with her. And EG is a very efficient team, so I think it suits their playstyle.
And would that be like more of a last pick kind of hero, or is it okay to pick it like 3rd, 4th?
It's okay to pick it 3rd or 4th if you're not like 100% set on the opponent knowing where you're going to put it. I think like Universe plays it occasionally, but I think it's okay 3rd or 4th.
Okay. All right. Well, Tusk has slipped through, and Bounty Hunter being in favor over Tusk here for Evil Geniuses. So that's still available. We'll see if maybe one of the teams still decides to ban it out here in the second phase. Rubik also being banned out by EG.
E.M also runs Bloodseeker a fair amount versus mids that like Queen of Pain and Viper, which is a little bit atypical just because Bloodseeker is viewed as like sometimes as a weak melee hero, but he actually stands up very very well versus the heavy harass from these range heroes, the heavy poison damage with poor main shield, as well as just being able to last hit very well mid, which is why I think they give the CTY very often. If you're really really good at last hitting in your lane, Bloodseeker is just godlike.